Section 7 of the Early Tudors by Charles Edward Moberly. This Librivox recording is in the public domain, read by Pamela Nagami. Chapter 6. Legislation for Ireland, English laws of Henry VII, Foreign Trade, Maritime Discovery, 1485 to 1509. The administration of Ireland in this reign, as indeed in most reigns, stood in such a different footing from that of England, that it is well to speak of it separately, if indeed we ought not rather to say that all administration there had come to an end since the days when the popular government of Richard Duke of York had drawn away so much of the country's strength, to perish in the Battle of Wakefield. Of course, as the Wars of the Roses got fiercer and fiercer, it became more and more out of the question to send either men or money there, or even to forbear from recalling its English colonists. Thus the purely Irish families recovered much of their lost ground, especially in Ulster. In the south and west, the few remaining English were content to assimilate themselves to the native Irish. So the Geraldines, as Spencer tells us, were so enraged at the death of the Earl of Desmond in 1467 that they rose in arms against Edward IV and renounced all obedience to the crown of England, carrying with them the greater part of the English in Munster, while the Norman families of Butler and de Burgh became as Irish as the ONeills or O'Donnells, living according to Breton law and making private war at their pleasure. Many of them took Irish names, adopted the Irish language, dressed in Irish fashion, contracted marriage and fosterage with the natives, formed their retainers into bastard septs, and instead of regular rents and services, learned to practise the irregular exactions called by the English coin and livery. These renegades to Irishry, says Mr. Goldwin Smith, seem to have imbibed even the peculiarities of Irish intellect, for the Earl of Kildare, the head of the Geraldines, being summoned to answer for an act of sacrilege in burning down the Cathedral of Cashel, pleaded in his defence that he thought the Archbishop was in it. To the strange attraction which thus acted upon the English settlers must be ascribed many of the sternest and most repressive Irish laws of the Plantagenets. Thus, if the Statute of Kilkenny, passed under Lionel, Duke of Clarence, in 1367, forbade the English to let the Irish graze cattle on their lands, its object was not so much to hinder Irishmen from prospering as to keep Englishmen aloof from the companionship which tempted them so strongly to forswear their country. The unchartered freedom of Irish life carried with it so strange an allurement that it was all which law could do to contend against it. If Ireland had any preference for either of the great contending parties in England, it was, as we have seen, for the House of York, and from this cause chiefly sprang the change of Henry VII's mode of governing the dependency, which, on ascending the throne, he had found all but severed from his dominions. At first he had thought it best to employ the native nobility for this purpose, and had chosen for deputy the Earl of Kildare, setting him, as the story ran, to rule all Ireland, because all Ireland could not rule him. When, however, he had time to reflect on the dangers springing from the Irish support of Simnel and Warbeck, from which he and his dynasty had escaped so narrowly, he perceived the necessity of bringing the country under a more regular government. Accordingly, he sent over in 1494, at the time when Warbeck was preparing for his descent on England, Sir Edward Poynings as Lord Deputy, a statesman and commander, well experienced in the most important affairs of the time. Poynings soon found that his military enterprises against Warbeck's wild Irish supporters in Ulster were always foiled in respect of the mountains and fastnesses in which the enemy found refuge. On this he accused his predecessor, Lord Kildare, of correspondence with the rebels, procured his attainder by the Irish Parliament, and ordered him to be arrested and sent to England. Meanwhile he summoned a parliament at Drogheda, and there carried among other acts the two most commonly associated with his name. By the first of these it was provided that all statutes lately made in England should be deemed good and effectual in Ireland. It had been common, as Mr. Hallam remarks, to extend to Ireland the operation of English statutes, even when that country was not particularly named, if the judges thought that the subject was sufficiently general to require it, and a majority of them had held in Richard III's reign that borough towns in Ireland were bound by statutes made in England. From the date of Poyning's law, all doubt was held to be cleared away as regards any English statutes passed before it, though it is hard to see how the expression statutes lately passed could be so all-embracing. Those subsequent to that date were not binding on the people of Ireland unless specially named or included under general words such as all His Majesty's dominions. It may be well here to remark that a declaratory Act of Parliament was passed in comparatively recent times, 1719, making it still more clear that the Crown, with the consent of the Lords and Commons of Great Britain in Parliament, had power to make laws to bind the people of Ireland. It was the repeal of this law which in 1782 led to the independence of the Irish Parliament, which lasted up to the Union of 1800. Still more important was the provision in another section of the same statute that no Parliament should be held in Ireland without the bills intended to pass at it being submitted to the King in Council. These were then to be returned to Ireland under the Great Seal, and either passed or rejected as seemed good to the Irish Parliament, but not altered or amended. Thus the Irish colonists, in spite of the status of Ireland as a separate kingdom, were debarred from the privilege of independent legislation. And yet, when we consider how small a portion of the population of Ireland they formed, and by what oppressive means they habitually aimed at securing the ascendancy, it can hardly be seriously denied that some such control was really imperative. This, in fact, is clear enough from other parts of the same statute which were aimed at curbing the lawlessness of the settlers. In case of one of their number being murdered, they were forbidden by it from pillaging or exacting a fine from the sept of the slayer, though this had been expressly allowed by the Dublin Parliament in 1475. Noblemen were restrained from private war, and from making the citizens of towns their retainers for this purpose, and coin and livery were again forbidden under stronger penalties. In the same year Henry suppressed the so-called Fraternity of St. George in Ireland, which had been established to meet the anarchy caused there by the Wars of the Roses, and bore some resemblance to the Spanish Hermandad described in Chapter 1. It consisted of 13 deputies sent up by the counties of Kildare, Dublin, Meath, and Louth, who bound themselves to maintain a small and quickly moving force of 120 archers and 40 horsemen, always ready to arrest rebels and those for whose apprehension warrants had been issued. Every year on St. George's Day the members met at Dublin and elected a captain for the ensuing year. To defray their expenses, the government had assigned to them the proceeds of a tax of 1 shilling in the pound on merchandise landed at Dublin. Doubtless the mode in which such a body acted would have too much of the appearance of private war to find much favour in Henry's eyes. After the recall of Sir Edward Poynings, the country was governed in an irregular way, sometimes under Lord Kildare, whose attainder was reversed by the English Parliament in 1495, sometimes under English governors, one of whom was Henry Dean, Bishop of Bangor, and afterwards Archbishop of Canterbury, whose power of persuasion had done much to secure the passing of Poynings' laws by the Irish Parliament. The mention just made of Henry's legislation in Ireland may properly introduce some account of his English enactments, which are most important and practical, founded as they are mainly on the admirable principle that obedience to existing laws and a general feeling of responsibility are what a good government should chiefly aim at securing. In fact, in spite of the many faults of Henry's administration, Lord Bacon seems quite justified in stating that in legislation he deserves a place among our early kings, next to that of Edward I. With regard to the power of the crown, he carried two highly important statutes. The first is that which exempts from the penalties of treason all who do service to a de facto king. Lord Bacon's view of this law is that it was rather just than legal, rather magnanimous than provident, as it made rebellion easy by securing from punishment those who served any pretender to the crown who might be strong enough to establish his power for a time. Yet, on the other hand, it would make rebels begin sooner to think of an accommodation, instead of fighting on as men do whose life is certain to be forfeited in case of defeat, and was therefore so far in favour of a king de jure. And when we think how manifestly just it was that the same law which made it treason, as in Sir W. Stanley's case, to express the slightest and most hypothetical doubt as to the title of an actual sovereign, should also protect those who upheld it, we may be inclined to recur once more to Burke's admirable dictum that in political matters magnanimity is always the truest wisdom. This law, passed in 1496, was in a manner counterpoised by an earlier one, 1488, which made it a capital crime to conspire the death of any of the king's council or of any lord of the realm. That of 1496 did not protect persons serving a possible republic or possible protector of England. Had it done so, Sir Henry Vane could not have been executed at the Restoration for the one crime of having been an energetic minister under the Republic. Another class of laws was aimed at the repression of acts of violence. Thus it was made in 1488 a capital crime to carry off heiresses or women of property in order to marry them by force. An instance had occurred in which a widow named Margaret had been so treated by a band of men, 100 in number, who had been pursued by 40 others, modo guerrino armati, armed in warlike manner, into another county, and there overcome and arrested. In the same year it was ordained that trials for murder should follow while the memory of the deed was fresh and evidence easily attainable, instead of being delayed, as they often were, for a year and a day, in order that the friends of the deceased might have a chance of first proceeding by the private and vindictive mode of action called appeal of murder, which Lord Macaulay has described in its application to the case of Spencer Compton. Another act of 1488 allowed justices to determine without a jury all the offences against unrepealed statutes except treason, murder, and felony. It was on this statute that Empson and Dudley relied in trying men privately in financial cases. But far the most important of the laws passed by Henry in favour of public order was that which in 1488 established the celebrated Court of Star Chamber. Its preamble states that the king, remembering how by unlawful maintenances, giving of liveries, untrue demeanings of sheriffs, and the making of panels, by taking of money by juries, and by great riots and unlawful assemblies, the policy and good order of this realm is almost subdued, and that for punishing these inconveniences little or nothing may be found by inquiry, that is, by an ordinary trial before a jury, ordains that the chancellor, treasurer, and privy seal, with a bishop and a temporal lord of the council and 2 judges, shall have authority to call before them offenders and witnesses, and to examine and punish them according to statute. This was held to be not so much a novelty as a parliamentary recognition of an ancient authority inherent in the Privy Council. At any rate, it furnished the Crown with a most powerful instrument for checking abuses, and was soon held to apply to forgery, fraud, perjury, contempt of court, and many other crimes, nay, even occasionally to civil causes. Hardly a term passed without juries being fined by it for acquitting felons or murderers contrary to the evidence. Sir John Hussey, a member of the Privy Council, was prosecuted in the Star Chamber in 1492 by Alice Fordman as accessory to the murder of her husband. Noblemen were indicted before it for sheltering outlaws or for interfering with the election of sheriffs, and justices of the peace punished for neglecting their duties. The fines imposed at this time by it, though mostly less ruinous than those of after days, when prosecutor and judges were alike enriched by them, were still such as thoroughly to daunt evildoers. Sometimes also men of rank had to appear almost naked and sue for pardon. Above all, the Court of Star Chamber aimed at enforcing the statute of livery, which prohibited under heavy penalties the maintenance by noblemen of large bodies of retainers wearing their livery and ready to wage private war in their behalf. All histories mention the enormous fine of 15,000 marks, equivalent to more than £100,000 of our money, which Henry inflicted on his staunch supporter, the Earl of Oxford, for breaking this statute in order to entertain him more splendidly. It appears to be a close imitation of the conduct of Louis XI in vindicating his sole right of chase by burning all the nets and other implements collected by the Sire de Montmorency for his use on a visit. It was, however, far more justifiable than this act of the French king, for it is evident that the Earl of Oxford's conduct, if established as a precedent, would at any time have justified noblemen in surrounding themselves with large bodies of warlike supporters just when the king was going to receive their hospitality, and thus to place himself most completely in their power if they had any treasonable intentions. Other laws of this period were aimed at benefiting the people according to the ideas then current. Henry, following the example of Ferdinand and Isabella, endeavoured to regulate the weights and measures throughout England. He introduced the first Navigation Act, providing that wine and woad from Saxony and Languedoc should be conveyed only in English vessels, and thus sacrificing cheapness in these commodities to the hope of creating a navy. He ordered that the bye-laws of trade guilds should not be binding till they had been sanctioned by the great officers of state. With a notion of humanity much in advance of his time, he got Parliament to enact that jailerships should not be patent offices, but should be always under the control and responsibility of the sheriffs. Abuses in prisons were, however, too deeply rooted to be thus abolished, and he provided the order for suits in forma pauperis, in which attorneys and counsel were assigned free of all charges to very poor men, a fact on which Lord Campbell has made the interesting remark that in our day counsel are always anxious to do their very best on such occasions, as also in defending persons accused of treason when fees are illegal. Another important part of Henry's legislation was that which had to do with foreign trade. This occupied much of his attention, as we might expect from a king who had watched Louis XI's exertions in this line. The chief exports of England at this time were wool, cloth, and hides. Our lead mines roofed nearly all the cathedrals and large buildings of Europe, and of tin we had a monopoly. The chief foreign market for wool was afforded by the Netherlands. Accordingly, one of the main objects of our commercial policy was to foster this trade, and also, if possible, to force English cloth into sale in Flanders, in spite of the jealousy felt there against the rising manufactures of England, which were bidding fair to supersede their own. As we have seen, the risks from this cause were much aggravated by Margaret of Burgundy's vehement hatred to the Lancastrian king, which had once caused the transference to Calais of the English staple. When this cause of difference had at length ceased, the Intercursus Magnus of 1496 replaced the Flemish trade on a sufficiently liberal basis. Besides its already mentioned provisions, it ordained that custom-house officers were to be polite, and not to break up packages needlessly, and that on no account were they to force sales to themselves. In case of injury, the aggrieved party was not to make reprisals, but to appeal to the offender's sovereign, and to avoid piracy, each owner was to deposit double the value of his ship and cargo, to be forfeited if his mariners could be proved guilty of that crime. Neither party was to allow foreign vessels to be attacked in its ports by any hostile power, or their plunder to be sold there. In case of shipwreck, the cargo might be reclaimed within a year and a day on payment of salvage expenses. Care was also taken to foster the Mediterranean trade, which subsequently lost much of its importance through Vasco da Gama's discovery of the sea route to the east by the Cape of Good Hope, 1497, but was still considerable in Henry VII's time. It was conducted almost entirely through the Republic of Venice, whose galleys used to come in flotillas to the English Channel and unload at Sandwich, Southampton, and London. Their cargo consisted of spices, including pepper, Malmsey wine from the Morea and Crete, sugar from Cyprus, Crete, and Alexandria, silk from Persia, Syria, Greece, and Sicily, cotton from Egypt and India, glass from the East and from the Murano factories at Venice, together with paper, illuminated books, and other articles. The Venetians exported in return the standard English commodities of wool, cloth, hides, lead, and tin, being liable, like other merchants, to a suit for non-use if they did not take return cargoes of English goods. The trade with France was chiefly for Gascon wines, woad from Toulouse, and salt, linen, and canvas from Bretagne. When Louis XII in 1504 avenged some injuries done to his subjects in England by forbidding the export of wines and French bottoms, this naturally compelled the English to use their own vessels for this purpose, a tendency much strengthened by the Navigation Act already alluded to. From Spain came large quantities of sweet wines, fruit, and fine Cordovan leather, manufactured from goat and kid skins, with the iron of Bilbao, which was much used for agricultural purposes because of its flexibility. The Spanish horses were also of a particularly fine breed and much prized as hacks and chargers. Accordingly, the commercial intercourse with Spain was considerable, and our merchants in Spain and Andalusia obtained in 1530 the privilege of meeting at Seville, Cadiz, or Sanlúcar, and there electing their own governors, with 12 ancient and expert persons to be their assistants, so that they might be defended from Spanish exactions and the tyranny of the Inquisition. It is remarkable that an unadventurous reign like that of Henry VII should have been one of such extensive maritime discovery. The lead in this direction was of course taken by other nations, especially the Portuguese, who were the first to apply the astrolabe to navigation, using it as we do the sextant for observations of latitude, and also the first to trust the mariner's compass for ocean voyages. They thus succeeded in reaching Cape Verde in 1443, Cape Sierra Leone in 1462, Cape Lopez in 1469, and the Cape of Good Hope in 1486. The right of discovery along the African coast was yielded to them by Spain in a treaty of 1479, in spite of the prior claims of the latter country as having colonized the Canaries in 1393. The establishment of a Portuguese monopoly in this direction naturally turned the thoughts of mariners in another, and as the hour had come when new discovery was almost imperative, so the man inspired to make it was not long wanting. In 1482 Cristoval Colon, whose name was Latinized into Columbus, vainly laid his projects for reaching Asia by sailing westward before the authorities of his native Genoa, who thought them beyond their means, and then before the Portuguese government, which tried to steal a march on him by privately dispatching a vessel in the direction indicated by him. Deeply resenting this ungenerous conduct, he went to Spain in 1484, and finding the delays there intolerable, dispatched his brother Bartolomeo to England in the next year. Bartolomeo was, however, taken by pirates and remained long in captivity. Thus it was only on February 13th, 1488, that he was able to present to Henry VII a map of the world drawn by himself, and to ask his patronage for his brother. The king liked the scheme so well that his offers actually preceded those made in Spain to Columbus, yet by a new series of cross accidents Bartolomeo reached Spain only after his brother's departure from Palos in 1492, and in fact after he had discovered the West Indies. Never surely since the world began was the fate of nations and continents decided by such a succession of strange casualties as those which, on the one hand, produced Columbus's success, and on the other ordained that Spain, not England, should be the power under whose flag it was achieved, and that the energy of our country should not be frittered away, as that of Spain was, upon a vast system of gold and silver mining by slave labour. Meantime, a healthier, though less romantic, series of discoveries was giving England the first claim to a Western empire of far superior ultimate value to all than even Mexico or Peru had to offer. As early as 1496, Henry VII issued to John Cabot, Gabotto, a Genoese mariner, long resident at Bristol, a patent of leave to discover unknown lands and to conquer and settle them. The king was to receive a fifth of the profits without paying any part of the charges. Instead of money, he gave a monopoly of trade with the countries to be discovered, and their government subject to the English crown. Like Columbus, Cabot hoped to find a passage to the Indies, only his aim was a northwestern instead of a due westward route. One ship alone could be chartered. This sailed from Bristol on June 24th, 1497, and Cabot was soon rewarded by the discovery of Newfoundland, whose fog banks must have been the strangest contrast to the sunny lands discovered by Columbus 5 years before. He then reached Cape Breton, which is called Prima Vista, and probably also Nova Scotia, thus seeing the mainland of America before Columbus, who only in his last voyage of 1498 coasted along the Isthmus of Panama. There is infinite reason to regret that Sebastian Cabot, John's son and successor, had not more of Columbus's enthusiasm and literary power, so as to put his memoirs in a shape which would have preserved them. We only know that he made, almost immediately after his father's death, one or more voyages on the original track, going as far north as the Arctic Circle, but being hindered from pressing beyond it or into Hudson's Bay by a mutiny of his crews, who were naturally alarmed at the masses of ice surrounding them. After this he entered the service of Spain, and in 1525 was commissioned to make a voyage to the Moluccas by the newly discovered Strait of Magellan. The discontent of his officers was, however, so threatening that he turned up the Rio de la Plata and spent some years in exploring the countries near it, ascending in boats the rivers Parana and Paraguay, and asking in vain for help to colonize these fine plains. In the course of one of his voyages, it is hard to say which, he ran along the American coast as far south as Florida, thus surveying not less than 1,800 miles of low and featureless shore. During his absence, the Bristol merchants sent light vessels westward almost every year in quest of new lands, and had he been in England in 1509, there is at least a possible chance that Henry VIII's ambition might have been turned to discovery rather than war. Under Edward VI, he came here again, receiving a pension of 250 marks and the title of Grand Pilot, an office which appears to have been created for him. Curiously enough, the only personal glimpse of the great navigator which we can obtain is an account of his deathbed. Few men have ever lived a more active life, nor were his efforts without immediate effect on the national welfare, considering the wealth ever since derived from the Newfoundland fisheries. But his chief glory will ever be that he provided against the time to come a reserved space practically inexhaustible for the swarming thousands of northern Europe, where every nerve would be strung by hardship and peril, where, in spite of the vast scale of obstacles, nature might still be subdued to men's needs, and where freedom would have a natural home. Such was the noble region discovered for England by this Italian mariner. nor ought we to ignore the mental effect of such additions to knowledge, and the extraordinary stimulus which they gave to thought. Just as learned Romans felt that the world became grander to them when the mystery of Britain was at length revealed by Caesar's invasion, so thinking men at the close of the 15th century saw with a kind of rapture creation thus broadening on their view. Before these days, says Peter Martyr in a letter to Cardinal Sforza, hardly half of the world's circumference was known to geographers. Of the rest only the feeblest and most uncertain mention had ever been made. But now, glorious to relate, light has, under the auspices of our sovereigns, been thrown on the secret of the ages. I feel my heart elated with real blessedness when I confer with intelligent men who have been in those countries. Let others delight in avarice or the lusts of the flesh, but let us be filled with rapture in thinking of God, who has revealed such wonders in our day. End of Section 7.